Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. Ukraine War Frontline update for the 5th of June 2024. As we commemorate the D-Day landings over these few days, let's remember how tough it was then for those who are fighting for freedom and how tough it is still for those fighting for freedom in ways that we thought we had bypassed, that history had forgotten, fighting in trenches for meagre amounts of territory in a meaningless war as far as many of us are concerned. I mean, it's incredibly meaningful, but in terms of what Putin is intending, goodness knows. Anyway, we will start with, well, if you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please freeze the video at the moment, pause the video and check out the key. Otherwise, we'll start in that northern area of Kharkiv Oblast, where there is again no change as according to the mappers. This is very significant considering this is a main vector of attack for the Russians, and it seems to have somewhat stalled. Just going to mention this, Randy Mott, who is, you know, I do like his opinions, rather political, but keeps a good eye on the war. This source down the bottom here, I'm going to go through when we get to Chazzy VR. But he just in general said even the best units at the beginning of the invasion displayed almost no tactical awareness or adaptation to the combat situation. Now their officer corps is depleted. The VDV units, that's the airborne units for the Russians, are in name only and filled mainly with Russians who have not been trained to do anything but minimally load and fire the single weapon they are given. I think it's a bit misleading to describe Russia as having endless manpower. This is not the Soviet Union. Disproportionate conscript de facto has hit many rural areas, rural areas with some political impact. At some point, the endless manpower has to draw on Moscow and St. Petersburg, and there will be political consequences. It's also impossible to raise and train an army with these attrition rates on the fly. Officers take years to train. Even a competent NATO infantry private has a year of training. Allies of Ukraine also need to step up on training support to allow new AFU manpower to be effective when called upon. Right now, the endless manpower means endless body bags when the Russians even bother to collect their dead. This is actually quite an important point that this will apply to both sides, of course, that your elite crack troops suffer from force quality dilution over time. So your crack troops, and I've said this many times, but there are new viewers, I have to repeat myself and to remind you. At the beginning of the war, in the kind of peacetime, if you like, the VDV, the airborne troops, the paratroopers, would have taken their recruits from the cream of those who had already been recruited into the army, contracted soldiers, no doubt, and seen them in training, said, right, we want them, and we want them, and we want him, and we want him. And they take the cream of the already trained crop, and they take them and they give them elite training, so they become crack troops. But what happened over the course of the war is these crack troops were used basically as your bog standard ground forces in so many areas that they suffered really heavy attrition rates. You look at what happened down in Vuhledar with the 44th, 155th Naval Infantry Brigades. Those are Marines as opposed to VDV, but it's the same thing. You know, you crack Marines and you crack VDV compared to your other troops. They were attrited and then they had to reconstitute them. Attrited, reconstitute. In fact, there are some claims that some of those crack, and it's probably more now, were reconstituted 9 times. And what you're doing then, you get to a point where, well, we can't take the cream of the crop. We are just basically, we'll take in anyone we can get. And so they take in newly mobilized people and just pull them into these units. Then those units are not the crack units they used to be, and you're losing your experience, you're losing the people to train up those new recruits, and so they end up just becoming as standard as any other unit. And so I don't think, and the way they were used, instead of using them to do some kind of flash attack here and then pull them back and let the conventional sort of units go in, they were just used to do what the conventional units were supposed to be doing. And the end result is that they are low on those quality troops. Now, you can say the same for Ukraine. Ukraine do have a few crack units, but again, they've been brought in to do, they were brought into Kharkiv shore up the gaps there. Now, whether they get used and attrited in the same way that the Russian crack troops have, I don't know. But it will be a challenge for both sides. Over time, you will have force. The force quality will be diluted. But having said that, then you do build up experienced troops who, when they survive, gain experience, and so you are obviously you're at war. You're training. You're not training. You're doing it, and you are improving potentially with each passing week of combat. So yeah, different dynamics to consider there. But certainly it appears that the Russians are just chewing through their manpower, and it's not just this endless. Yes, they have, and I'll say this just one more time, but I'll probably say it again actually. Yes, there is this massive difference between Russia's manpower resources of 140 million and Ukraine's of 40 million, although it's probably a lot less than that. You will get to a point where you won't be able to keep drawing on those resources in Russia because people will kick off. And that will happen before that relatively similar point in Ukraine, because Ukraine are fighting for their existential future. They will go through that threshold and keep going because they have no other option, whereas the people in Russia do have another option. They don't need to be fighting in that war. So this kind of idea that there's 100 million more people, therefore they can just chew through 100 million more people before people go, hang on, this is not a good idea, is not true. And you need to be careful with that. I mean, it's easy to say that. You can see, well, they've got loads more to draw from, so surely they can just fight for an awful lot longer. But actually, in a war that's not necessary, you will have loads more dynamics. You'll have economic pressures as well that Ukraine will be experiencing very differently, because there are 50 different nations supporting them economically, financially, and in terms of military equipment. Russia don't have that, and so things will bite a lot sooner for the Russians, I think, than one might otherwise have predicted. Okay, so onto the Institute for the Study of War. The American military think tank, select military commentators continue to complain about superior Ukrainian drone and electronic warfare capabilities on the battlefield, continuing to highlight the rapid and constant tactical and technological innovation cycles that are shaping the battle space in Ukraine. I've seen from so many different sources now. I was just watching a NAFO video on their latest, the 28th, I think, bunch of vehicles they're sending from, Estonia to Ukraine, and they had people from different units that were receiving these vehicles, and they're also giving out drones. And they were saying, yep, we have at the moment the drone advantage due to campaigns like this. We're receiving so many drones from all these different places that we do admittedly have the drone advantage. Now, before, you had a lot of troops who are saying, no, the Russians do, and it was very hard to get a proper sense of who's got the advantage. So we went to looking at data from video feeds, and we're finding out that actually it looks like the Ukrainians had the advantage and have continually had the advantage in most areas for a good few months now, maybe longer in certain other ways that drones are used. But now it seems increasingly that the Ukrainians do have that drone advantage, according to many more sources than just, say, looking at the Tochny data and whatnot. Russian forces recently advanced near Vovchansk, Siversk and Donetsk city, say the ISW, and that's what we're going to look at. Vovchansk is an interesting one because there's no change, and there has been no change in favour of the Russians for some days there, but the ISW says there is. The Russian military reportedly continues to forcibly send Russian military personnel, including those with serious medical issues, to fight in Ukraine. And that was they talk about that further up in the report, but I've already talked about this 2 days in a row, that they are pulling apparently from refuseniks and people who have got exemptions, people who have been injured previously and don't want to go back to fight. They are rounding them up. Well, they're sort of incarcerating them, waiting for trial, and then before they get a trial, they just send them into meat grinding units in, among other places, Kharkiv. So that again shows you that things aren't well. And if you're talking about when that threshold is going to be met for when the Russians are going to get fed up with this, well, you've got your soldiers getting fed up and refusing to fight, and you've got families understanding that they're going to be contacted by these people who are going to be saying, look, I've been incarcerated, I'm fed up with this, I don't want to fight, this is a pointless war, or like everyone's getting killed and they'll get this to this critical mass moment, a tipping point perhaps, where there are too many body bags coming back and the Russians start kicking off domestically, as we kind of saw in the Afghanistan conflict for Russia, where 12 years or however long it took, and far fewer deaths actually, and that precipitated the end of that conflict for Russia. Russia continues efforts to militarize deported Ukrainian youth and prepare them for future service in the Russian armed forces. So, that's clearly how desperate they are for forces. Right, now to talk about Vovchansk area particularly. Russian forces recently advanced near Vovchansk amid continued Russian offensive operations in the area on June the 4th. Geolocated footage published yesterday indicates that Russian forces recently advanced on the northern outskirts of Staritsia. And I have shown you that video where a number of troops were ambushed and then fell into basically a few dugouts and small trenches and then were hit repeatedly by drones. Now, this is in this particular area of Staritsia and apparently shows an advance. I think I showed this to you previously. Stopped going on. So that's actually in the grey zone. So this blue line is the Russian defensive line, as according to Andrew Perpetua, and this blue line is the Ukrainian defensive line, and all here is a defensive line where you would imagine a Russian attack might take place. And since it was an ambush, you've got Ukrainians there. It is beyond the defensive line of deep state maps, and it's well behind the defensive line of Surat Maps, a pro-Russian mapper. I would suggest that Surat Maps is wrong here and the other two are correct. This was an attack. I mean, it was an ambush attack into Ukrainian. If it's not controlled, I mean, it seems like at the most it is actually grey zone, but you have small arm fire from Ukrainians and then 3 drones hitting them. So Ukrainians are there, Russians there, get hammered, and the Russians die. I don't think either that supports Surat Maps's claims about what's going on there, and I don't actually think it supports the ISW's claim that the Russian forces advance. I mean, they're physically advancing. This is what I talked about the other day, like language. I'm not quite sure sometimes where they mean, well, they were advancing. They advanced, as in some people moved forward. Yeah, but the control lines don't move forward. They move forward, get killed, and you're back to where you started. So there's no advance in the general sense of the Russian army. Ukrainian forces control roughly 70% of Vovchansk. Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian artillery units are trying to destroy crossings over the Vovcha River within Vovchansk to complicate Ukrainian logistics, and claim that Russian forces have already destroyed 3 crossings in the town. I talked about this a little bit yesterday. A Ukrainian platoon commander operating in northern Kharkiv stated that Russian forces continue to conduct infantry assaults in the area and that Russian vehicles do not approach within 3 to 5 kilometers of the international border to avoid Ukrainian strikes. That is absolutely incredible. So that's to say all this fighting is taking place here, and it is tough, and both sides are hammering the heck out of Vovchansk from the air, but that the Russians are not advancing to within, I don't know, what's that? That's 2.6 kilometers. And if we go back to there, so 3 to 5 kilometers, they're not, there are no Russian vehicles in that kind of area on the way to the front line because of the fear of getting hit by the prevalent Ukrainian drones. Well, that means that's a border. So how are they? Then you got all this area that the Russians supposedly control. How are they supplying their troops? And this is why the claim is that they're using golf carts and motorbikes and really quick vehicles that are possibly harder to hit or whatever, or maybe they just don't have as many vehicles to use at their disposal. But yeah, challenging for the Russians around there, that's for sure. And then where do we get to? So a prominent Kremlin-affiliated Russian mill blogger claimed that Russian forces are building fortifications north of Vovchansk, but noted that Ukrainian forces conduct frequent drone strikes against Russian engineering equipment, that likely complicating this effort. Digging field fortifications in the vicinity of the international border area remains challenging for both Russian and Ukrainian forces due to pervasive drone and indirect fire threats coming from the opposing side. And that's that for that northern area. Not too much more to report there. No reports, however, does say that yesterday a group of 60 Russian fighters surrendered to Ukrainian forces. I reported that yesterday. He's repeating that. So that is really significant. That tells you things are not going well if they just, down sticks and say, yeah, we're giving up 60 of them. And then what you've got to ask is, what effect will that have on the rest of their troops? Seeing that or hearing that when they're back that night, having had a terrible day of fighting, being pressured backwards possibly, and to think that 60 of my mates have now down sticks and surrendered, that will then hopefully move like wildfire through the Russian forces and sow seeds of doubt. The map shows newly recaptured areas. If Ukraine is able to hold momentum, it could be able to force Russians out of Vovchansk completely. I mean, that's obviously the hope there. But no change, it seems, from the mapping changes yesterday. Surat maps admitting that indeed the Russians have been pushed back here. No activity, it is believed, south of the Vovcha River, as according to most analysts. No Russian activity, that is. So looking better for the Ukrainians up there, even though the ISW did say that the Russians have made some advances, but as mentioned, I don't think that's actually true. And then we come to the northeastern axis from Kupiansk to Svatova to Crimea. No changes there. That's incredibly good news for the Ukrainians. And also could go towards the idea that the Russians are pulling troops away from this northeastern sector. And I saw some further claims along this line yesterday to do with Russian units being moved. We have Seversk, no change there. There was talk yesterday about Rozdalivka, if you remember, in this kind of general area. The Russians having a tiny bit of success there. No change to Chaziv Yar, which is very important, although there is change if you know where to look. And this is thanks to JR, who did the mapping today, and he alerted me to the fact that this area here, although there's no changes to the mapping, there has been quite a big change to Andrew Perpetua's grey zone. And so, yes, well, the best thing for me to do is actually show you here. This is Chaziv Yar, where the Russians attacked to the canal and apparently up it and got over the canal, etc., etc. And there are various claims that they're taking Kalinivka, which is this small settlement there. They come down through Bodanivka, got to the canal there and across the canal, because remember, we have, let's bring that up, with culvert there, that is prime real estate for getting your vehicles across. The problem is that although there is ground that you can effectively drive across, although there are a couple of pipelines you need to deal with there either side, there are trees either side. It's forestry either side. And so actually getting your vehicles through that forest and then through that forest when you don't know where the enemy are is not easy going. So yes, you can cross there, but no, you can't cross there. It's kind of what I'm saying. So it appears it's predominantly infantry led. The same can be said about this culvert here. So the culverts are both in heavily wooded areas. Now, there was talk on reporting from Ukraine over the last couple of days that the Russians had attacked here, had trying to move through this forest area and had basically been cut off because they tried to attack here, got foiled. And there's claims that they're trying to attack north from this kind of area as well. And there are claims that they are being cut off by the Ukrainians while also having artillery and drones do their thing on them. This is difficult terrain. This is a sort of bluff there. If you look at the height, go to the bottom right. So this is 148 meters and that is 211. So that's a 60-meter drop there, that bluff, and that is fairly significant. This is kind of the area that the Russians have to go through. This is a nature reserve, so there are not going to be roads and stuff going through here, and the Russians have found it, I think, fairly difficult to operate without the use of mechanized equipment. But if we come back up to Kalinivka here, we have seen that Surat Maps has extended the Russian control to this area. Andrew Perpetua, over the last 3 days, has said, right, okay, there was an attack, but we keep it grey zone. This is where the attack was. We've got Ukrainian drones operating there. We've got Russian attack that we've seen on video evidence. But I'm not saying that they control that area. They just attacked there, and it appears they were repelled. And then, lo and behold, the next day, Andrew Perpetua has this all in blue, which means the Ukrainians appear to have counterattacked it. So the Russians are now hitting those same areas that the Russians were in with their own drones. Now, and shelling. So if they're hitting this with drones and shelling, they don't control it. They're not bombing their own people, though. Who knows? In other words, no map changes in terms of Russian defences can sometimes belie the fact that there's an awful lot of activity going on. The Russians have attacked. In this case, the Russians have attacked. They haven't got robust control, but they've done a big manoeuvre. They've been defeated, and the Ukrainians have counterattacked and retaken that land. Looks on my map like nothing's happened because I'm only showing the Russian defensive positions. Although what we can see is that Syriac Maps is comfortable with saying Ukraine still control that land. And the problem is, well, they obviously don't control that land because the Russians still control that land because they're bombing that land. They are hitting it with drones and hitting it with artillery. So yeah, take many of the claims with a pinch of salt, but also understand that no mapping changes can still mean that there is a lot of dynamic activity going on. And that's why JR is very keen, particularly on showing the grey zone, because you can see how big the grey zone is. So previously, that grey zone would have been reaching back to there as we show the Andrew Perpetua grey zone. So it's back now to broadly where it was, but it was all the way down there, although I might not have explicitly shown that to you. Right, okay, coming out. Oh no, let's stay in Chasiv Yar because I've got Randy Mott's. Well, it's not actually. He's referring to this source that says so. Russia has two disasters happening right now: Chasiv Yar and Kharkiv. And I've talked about Kharkiv and how I think that's an operational disaster for them. But the analyst provides a breakdown of the situation in Chasiv Yar. Now, reporting from Ukraine has also talked about this area, but we'll go into this. So, from quote the analyst, by far the biggest news in the Russian offensive south of Chasiv Yar is the Russian offensive south of Chasiv Yar. That was designed to push west, then up and behind Ukrainian forces in the Canal district. This is what I was talking to you about concerning this area with the bluff, and reporting from Ukraine talking about this. So they used the forest to build up two assault groups, one to strike north and one to strike west. This is a section of the canal that goes under the hill in a tunnel with a forest above it, and the only place the Russians can cross it with vehicles of any weight. This would let them advance into the western front and then north to the more weakly defended residential areas. If they captured the Novi residential district, they would cut Ukrainian supplies into the canal district and force them out, which is to say, let's get the old drawing tools on here. That's to say the Russians would be looking to do this. Okay, they would want to come along here and over the culvert and attack this district, and that would allow them to cut off, interdict this road eventually, which would then cut off the canal micro district. That would then allow the Russians to take that, and you get, Ukrainian surrendering and all sorts, and you'd also attack it from up here, from two directions, and then ideally from where we were talking about earlier, you could attack it south from there, and that would be their general intentions. The Russian idea on paper sounds fine. Yep, it does. But the reality of it's more complex. For one, it's most completely road and track free. It's almost completely road and track free. Like I said, it's a nature reserve. So the ideas of vehicles in support quickly becomes moot. The area can only really be traversed by infantry, and even then only slowly. Add to that the crossing between the forests isn't forested itself, leaving a wide open area to traverse on foot in full view. So the Russian troops on their way to begin their attacks were constantly under attack from drones and artillery. So what it's talking about is you got this area where the pipes are that's open, where you can be seen crossing and hit by the many drones that are around. You've also got a large open area there too. That it just becomes challenging for the Russians. Where was I? The Russians also, their attacks were constantly under attack from drones and artillery. The Russians also didn't seem to realise that they couldn't use airstrikes because they had no way of distinguishing their forces or their location in the density of the forest. Despite the Russians carried out the attack getting to the outskirts of the Novi district. The Ukrainians used reconnaissance drones to map out the path the Russians were taking and quietly kept their own forces in the forest, slowly preparing to attack as they got into position. This is what Reporting for Ukraine's video was on. Once ready and guided by drones, the Ukrainians pounced on Russian infantry groups one at a time, eliminating them in surprise attacks. The Russians lost hundreds of men in the attacks, and even the Russian sources say they gave up trying. Having failed moving west, and bizarrely not having launched both attempts simultaneously, the other Russian group attacked northwards. Again, they had to cross open territory and quickly lost most of their manpower and equipment. A T-90M assault tank, 3 BMDs and an armoured car were lost in short order. The whole operation was carried out by the supposedly elite airborne forces, and that goes back to Randy Mott's point about the airborne forces having force quality dilution. So yeah, trying to attack up there, getting done, trying to attack up there, getting done, and losing huge amounts of troops in so doing by all accounts, and quite a bit of equipment. So that seems to be a good area for the Ukrainians in terms of loss ratios, one would suppose. Right, then we come down to Avdiivka area, and we can see some small gains to the north on the way to Novoalexandriivka, really on the outskirts there, as according to all the mappers, the Russians just tipping into that settlement. Not too much disagreement between the mappers there, so it's certainly challenging as the Russians plod onwards in that direction. Then we come down past Netalove, past Krasnohorivka to here. This is on the way to Konstantinivka and Paraskevivka. Right, I know this will seem weird to you who have just been listening to this video, and I was hopefully making a cogent case for what is going on the front line. I've just been to the pub to meet Dell, who helps do the stats for the morning updates and whatnot. And so I don't know whether I have a train of thought that can continue from where I was. I assume I was around here, which is south of Mariinka. You can see that the Ukrainians have been pushed back, as according to all the mappers here, Andrew Perpetua, Surrey maps in the darker red there, Andrew Perpetua lighter red, and the orange of deep state maps to show that the Russians have been pushing north of Novomykhailivka, west of Novomykhailivka at Paraskevivka, and south of the town as well, even down to Solodka, where they've been pushing here. So some serious gains for the Russians in that area. The main source I have here to support at least something going on there is from Special Kherson Cat here, saying, as claimed, Russian AFVs targeted by Javelin anti-tank guided missiles during an attempted assault on Ukrainian positions somewhere in the area between Novomykhailivka and Vuhledar, indeed between Solidar. So losing some equipment around here, obviously attacking. There's been claims of quite a bit of activity in this area around Vuhledar for the last few days, and you can see that Andrew Perpetua has the Ukrainian line, fairly far back here as the Russians are pushing on. Agreement from all the mappers of that area taken the other day, and possibly a little more subsequently. Let's see where that attack with a few bits of mechanized equipment was. Yep, so that's into the grey zone, and that would support everything really that you see on the map there. Doesn't necessarily show any gain for the Russians in that area. No real content from the ISW, Institute for the Study of War, in this general area, other than what you can see with the pins. But this is a bit of a concern, because that front seems to be fairly significant for the Russians. There's talk about Pobyeda. There's also talk about Novelska on the cards again, because that is going to be key for holding the Russians back in this whole sector. But certainly not looking rosy for the Ukrainians south of Mariinka on the way to that southern front line. And then as we come past Velika Novosilka, no change to the front line there, and some slight change to the Robotna area as according to Deep State Map that brings their mapping in line with Andrew Perpetua, but nothing particularly significant. I don't think that signifies any change, any offensive or gains over the last 24 hours, just an alignment of the mappers there. And then we're going to come to look at the Dnipro area. I'm going to take away the extra lines there from the contested. There we go. And that just hopefully shows a bit more clarity if that actually works. There we go. Thank you very much. Now we don't have the Ukrainian defensive lines because the way we derive that data from Andrew Perpetua's map, it takes all the islands into account, so you just get blue lines everywhere. We'll keep it to the Russian lines here in the Krinky area. We're going to pop into the Institute for the Study of War just for their section on Pobieda mentioned there, just their section on Krinky here. Russian forces conducted limited ground attacks on the east or the left bank of the Dnipro River and in the delta yesterday, but there were no confirmed changes to the front line in this area. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that Ukrainian forces repelled several unsuccessful Russian attacks near Krinky on the evening of June the 3rd and during the day of June the 4th. Russian mill bloggers claim that Russian airborne VDV and naval infantry elements, so those are both the crack forces, or at least they were at one point during the war, are working to clear a limited number of Ukrainian troops from the islands in the Dnipro River Delta and prevent Ukrainian landing attempts on the east bank of the Dnipro. Doesn't give us too much detail, trying to stop the Ukrainians landing on the east bank. I don't know if that means that they are clearing out the Ukrainians from Krinky. I really don't know what's going on here and how much presence the Ukrainians still have, if any. Could be the last remnants of Ukrainian troops holding out as the rest of them have pulled out. And I presume the rest of the activity is going to be further down the line in terms of these islands. Although, to speak of where it says clearing Ukrainian troops from the islands in Dnipro River Delta and prevent Ukrainian landing attempts on the east bank, that could actually be these sort of islands, if you want to call them that, in the delta here by the Konka River. And it could be that the Russians are trying to force the Ukrainians back from there so that they can't land again over here, rather than further down in these more obvious islands, if you like. But I don't know. It's not enough for me to go on, at least in that report. Anyway, that's enough from me. Sorry it has taken far longer because I started this video about 5 hours ago, maybe more. No, I started it before I went to my son's football presentation. So it was about, a long time ago, about 8 hours ago. Apologies. Anyway, it's here finally. Thanks for watching. Take care. Speak soon. Toodle pips.